is not a structural failure. It's more of the psychological failure.
And what Western policymakers chose to believe.
It was absolutely unbeneficial.
Ukraine has had to fight for its survival across these two radically different American administrations.
It is much more than about Ukraine, because Russia violated the basics of the international law.
Which Europe are we actually dealing with right now?
Ukraine crossed a lot of those so-called red lines and no actions after these.
Welcome to Power Play. Today's episode is a very interesting one because we are now seeing a tectonic shift in global politics, global security, and most importantly, international institutionalism. My guest today will be speaking about what I call as the world on fire, but from Kyiv to Tehran perspective, from Biden to Trump administration, and of course the erosion of the rules-based order. Today we'll be speaking to Dr. Hanna Shelest, Director of Security Studies and Global Outreach Programs at the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism. Dr. Shelest has a very, very important knowledge that needs to be shared with the global audience. She's an Ukrainian. She has lived through the entire Russian occupation since 2022. She has seen the global changes, European changes, dilemma, dichotomics, paradoxes, and everything. And she has been the editor-in-chief at Ukrainian Analytica. She has served as non-resident senior fellow at SEPA, Washington, D.C. She has been a senior researcher at the National Institute for Strategic Studies, Ukraine, under the President of Ukraine. In 2024, she was a visiting research fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome. She has taught at the Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine, George Marshall European Center for Security Studies, Swedish Defense University, Ukrainian Catholic University, and that makes her an absolutely a fascinating intellectual. At the same time, she has contributed in shaping Ukrainian foreign policy, defense policy, and she actually developed scorecards of the Ukrainian foreign policy 2015-2025, and I think this is a very unique approach to really measure how the foreign policy is moving. She was one of the recognized intellectual who was recognized as 40 under 40 Ukrainian emerging leader. That also tells us that her credibility across the Ukrainian society is so astronomically deep that we are very proud that she could make time from Kyiv and we are sitting in Dhaka. Welcome, Hanna.
Hello, it is my great pleasure to join you. And by the way, today I'm not in the capital, but on the south of Ukraine in Odessa. So we will also have a wonderful perspective from the Black Sea.
Perfect. And we have a segment to discuss about the Black Sea too. Now, let me start with one critical question. When the Russian invasion happened, I mean, I have seen you talking in international media, you're writing, and I have also seen that the Ukrainian expert community who had been tracking Russian hybrid warfare and Black Sea strategy long before February 2022. And the full-scale invasion, when it took place in 2022, it shocked the world, shocked the West, and most importantly, shocked the international order, I mean, the stability within the international order. How much of a surprise was it for Kyiv? And what does that gap between what Ukrainian analysts knew and what Western policymakers chose to believe tell us about the structural failures of Western strategic forecasting? Hanna.
You know, I would say that it is not a structural failure. It's more of the psychological failure. And here we have several baselines, probably, which we need to remember. Even I, 2 weeks before the full-fledged invasion, said that the probability of this invasion is just 30%. Because from all the rational, logical analysis, we expected that it would be some kind of the small border provocation, or it would be offense at the eastern front line, where we had a war since 2014. But nobody could imagine that Russia would go with such a serious offensive all around the front line, trying to occupy Kyiv and to change the government there, because it was absolutely unbeneficial. Even, by the way, Russian experts were writing that they were surprised, as it is unbeneficial. Russia could get much more by negotiations than by starting a war. And Russia was planning it only for 3 days, not for 4 years where we are now. But the issue is that psychologically, you still wanted to believe that Russian leadership is rational, that they understand all the disadvantages of the full-fledged war, that they will pressure us, they will pressure the United States, the European leaders. But all this military buildup is just to persuade, to be more persuasive, to threaten, rather than really to conduct a military hostilities at the Ukrainian territory. From the Ukrainian side, we constantly been ready to the certain provocations to start. Not that we expected this scale, but we've been in the war since 2014. So understandable that somehow at the back of your head, you have this expectation. From the Europeans, when I talked after the beginning of the war with the different advisors to the presidents, to the ministers of foreign affairs, who are my friends, and said like, okay, we all had the same information. What's happened? Why different capitals in Europe reacted differently? And one thing really shocked me when one of the colleagues said, Anna, a lot of people who've been in the decision making, they still remember 2003 and Iraq. So yes, we all had the same intelligence data, but they were still notes of skepticism about the United States because how they provided information about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq before the invasion. So they were really fierce that probably now it's also happening, these not disinformation, but let's say a little bit of the manipulation with the facts. So we lost that momentum when we had the data, we had the intelligence reports, but we had the two psychological blocks. First is trust to the United States. Second is hope that Russia is rational.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, this is very important because this is something is largely missing in our conversation and rhetorics about Ukraine and the information and intelligence, how it actually transformed into psychological failure rather than intelligence failure. And that you have rightly mentioned about U.S., the role of U.S., and obviously Iraq, WMD. And there is a sense of skepticism that actually worked within the European theater. That brings me to my second question. I mean, as you have mentioned about the United States, I mean, Biden administration and the Trump administration, you now have two types of doctrines, but it's all about one particular war. Ukraine has had to fight for its survival across these two radically different American administrations, right? Biden offered solidarity, but was largely accused of calibrating support to avoid escalation in ways that prolonged the war. But at the same time, Trump administration came with transactionality, with a plan which you described as not a peace plan at all, and you have mentioned it. And from Ukraine's strategic point of view, which American posture was actually served Ukraine's interest best? And what does the Trump administration reveal about the future of U.S. security commitments in Europe and perhaps beyond Europe? Because you've been to Ricina dialogue very recently, so you can expand your thoughts beyond Europe too.
Both presidents have first of all served the U.S. interest, and we should be aware of this. Doesn't matter how many times we would call for the universal values, the open act of aggression, the necessity to protect the United Nations Charter, but we understand perfectly that, first of all, both Biden and Trump serve the interest and the vision of the world by the United States, not by Ukraine. And here is the question is just, are we able to understand their preferences and priorities and to explain why it has been important to support Ukraine? Because the Russian war against Ukraine, yes, it is very about Ukraine and about the Russian colonial policy. But at the same time, it is much more than about Ukraine because Russia violated the basics of the international law. They violated more than 400 international conventions. They are continuing doing this in such a manner that it has the huge spillover effect. And we know that the bad guys are learning much quicker than the good guys. But if to compare just the two presidents and how they act about Ukraine, with Biden, our problem was that a lot of people in his team considered that China is the biggest threat than Russia, and that you need to somehow divide Russia from China. So in this case, it's better not to make Russia too weak. What was important, yes, so for Russia would not be capable to continue the war. And the second is that they constantly been afraid of escalation. And that was our biggest problem, because each time you're asking, okay, what type of escalation you would like? Russia already used all type of the equipment against us, all type of the ammunition, from strategic missiles, ballistic missiles, any type of the war crimes in Mariupol, in Bucha. Like, what else are you waiting for? What does mean escalation? And when we did a lot of the research and interviews, talking to different people in the US, de facto, we were coming to the same answer: nuclear weapons use. Because the start of the war was so irrational, so people in Washington, but let's be honest, also in Paris, Berlin, and other capitals, they really believed that one moment Russia can use nuclear weapons. So they believed in the Russian red lines, and they didn't know what to do with these. Even that Soviet Union also had a nuclear weapon, even bigger amount than what Russia currently had, and in the much better condition. But it was more predictability in their eyes from the decision making in the Soviet Union rather than in the modern Moscow. But here, we definitely tried to explain, and it was possible to work with the Biden administration with certain logical explanations. First, that Russian red lines are not so red. They're very often rosy. Ukraine crossed a lot of those so-called red lines and no actions after these. For example, when we destroyed their Navy headquarters in Crimea. But at the same time, that for Russia, nuclear is like Viagra. You know, it is the final what they can use, because if they use nuclear weapons, it means they demonstrate that it's total failure with the conventional weapons and their armed forces are not capable to fight. So in this case, it was long, painful conversations with the White House, but it was possible to persuade them. With Trump administration, the situation is a little bit more difficult because they would like to have quick decisions. They are not ready for the long negotiations. They really would like to have peace in Ukraine, so we cannot blame them of being pro-Russian or something like this. The question is that they have an absolutely different way of negotiations and the approach to any type of the world affairs. They do it as business. We want it now, quickly. They think that everything can be negotiated, and they think that it is about something material. When they speak about land in the east of Ukraine, they speak about it as the land for the real estate. They forget about people. They forget about the policies. They forget about the nationhood. That's for them is secondary. That's why partially with Trump, it's more difficult to have conversations, because war is not something what you're doing quickly. And the second is because it's unpredictable. You don't know how the position can change tomorrow.
Oh, this is very interesting. I mean, you've been quite candid about the Trump administration's approach. I mean, of course, the Russia remains as the white elephant over here. I mean, certainly there is a growing understanding that the U.S. may not want to see Russia to become too weak, as you have mentioned. And then, of course, the issue of quick fix and perhaps the logical or rational approach is sometimes being questioned. I mean, that really makes me think about the Trump-Witkoff 28 points, which you have been quite direct by saying that this is not at all a peace plan. Can you walk us through why? Because some provisions, Article 5 style guarantees, EU membership eligibility, a reconstruction fund, seem to offer Ukraine something real. I mean, what does Russia actually gain from this framework that you have mentioned is not at all a peace plan? And is there any version of negotiated settlement Ukraine could accept without it becoming another template for future aggression elsewhere? Because this will bring us to the Iranian question later on. Anna.
Yes, I'm opening that 28 points and are just trying to remember it all in detail, considering that as for now, we already don't speak about these 28 points. Quite quickly, we moved it to the 20 points, then for a few others. If you go in general, not point by point, what's been the problem? First of all, even from linguistic point of view, when you read the document, you see the Russian wording. That were a lot of the translations from the Russian language. So you understand that a lot of these points being proposed by the Russian side. And many of the points just remembered us the April 2022, when we had negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul. The issue of the guarantees being probably the easiest and the most difficult, because it was just the general phrase. Ukraine will have guarantees from the United States. What type of the guarantees? What the US would do? How it would protect in case Russia continued the war? This ambiguity, it's not something you would like to have, considering that we already had Russian promises after 2014, and we had 1994 with the so-called Budapest Memorandum. But Russia also tried to include a lot of the stuff that would undermine Ukrainian nationhood and statehood, first of all, that would allow them to intervene in the domestic affairs of Ukraine. And originally, there were even proposals, for example, that Ukraine cannot have any military exercises with foreign forces at its territory. And any type of the military exercises should be guaranteed allowed by all, and then it is a long list of the countries. Really, including Russia. So if I would like to have a tabletop exercises in Ukraine, I need to ask Russia, the country that previously attacked me, what type of the peace agreement. Then it was the significant shortage of the Ukrainian armed forces. Again, usually that is the condition you put to the aggressor, not to the victim of the aggression. And you see that what it was on the table, they were nothing really about peace. I'm not even speaking about the justice or the just peace. That was something with the attempt to overwhelm with the proposals and then to blame Ukraine that you don't want to sign it. So it is us in Moscow who would like to have peace and you in Ukraine who doesn't want to have peace. But already having Minsk agreements with Russia, we knew the devil is in details, so we couldn't allow just such attacks to go forward.
Because I mean, I'm quite fascinated to hearing your answer. This reminds me one very fascinating, perhaps for the international community, the press conference between President Donald Trump and President Zelensky in Washington. And that was quite an optics for the international community. I mean, what does it tell us? I mean, is it that the U.S. is increasingly becoming less interested in Ukraine? Or is it that President Zelensky was not able to articulate his demands? Or perhaps it was just that the Russia was actually invisibly present during that particular discussion? What does it actually mean to the international world?
I imagine that you refer to that Oval Office interaction. Correct. That really made the news, because luckily after this we had a lot of the other very positive press conferences and True. Interactions of two presidents. That incident was really strange for everybody, because it looked like a provocation. Are they intentional or not intentional? Intentional was definitely provocation of the journalist. That doesn't have any sense, because then you saw plenty of the question about the suit, for those of the listeners who don't remember, because then you had plenty of negotiation that Mr. Trump had just in his golf suit, or plenty of the world leaders who came definitely not in the suit to the White House. So that question was strange and provocative, just for some kind of and especially when we know the personality of the journalist who asked. That a separate story. But even with those emotions from the vice president, who've been silent during the whole conversation, and then suddenly in the end started provoking and saying that Ukrainian president is not grateful, when Ukrainian president constantly been saying how grateful we are to the US government, that looked strange from all perspectives. Is it exactly Russia being, or just a shadow of Russia? That's another question. We know that at that time, Mr. Witkov definitely trusted a lot the Russian representatives. He trusted and believed in all their statements that was very easy just to debunk. And we saw the change in their positions when they acknowledged these after these. But that's why we really would like just to cross that incident and consider it not as the policy, but the incident. The only lesson that we definitely learned from that event is that current US administration prefer to pressure Ukraine, who is weaker than Russia. And that is a huge mistake, because first of all, by pressing Ukraine, you are avoiding the aggressor. You're not bringing peace quicker, because Russia is just increasing their demands instead of becoming more agreeable. The second lesson is that the US administration, unfortunately, has not learned one important thing. Russia is calling for negotiations, or saying that they're ready for negotiations, exactly when the US is promising stronger sanctions. If you follow the last 4 years, you would find a very clear timeline that Russia is calling for negotiations not to stop the war, but they are calling negotiations exactly when the new sanctions package is promised. So they know that they can postpone it. That's important for them. And the third lesson is never say that somebody doesn't have cards. First of all, even at that time, Ukraine had cards. And that was demonstrated by the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces, that we didn't allow Russia, like they still, after 12 years, cannot occupy even the Donetsk region. They, after 3 years, occupied only 1% of our territory, with more than 1 million of casualties. So it's not that you are stronger with such numbers. But then we see the situation now in the Middle East, and where everybody is coming, which armed forces are the only one with the real experience that is eager to share with our partners, and with the technologies that other countries definitely don't have. It is Ukraine. So now everybody asking us, even being in the war, to help with their defense, including the United States. So sometimes it's better not to provoke such statements.
Oh, this is very, very important, because you have really touched one of the soft belly of current conversation, that Ukraine's possible engagement in the Middle East too. But at the same time, you have rightly mentioned that the pressure factor coming in, or sometimes bypassing the negotiations and looking towards extra diplomatic measures certainly creates another complicated situation. That leads me to a very critical question about Europe once again. We will come to Iran later. Europe once again. It's pretty much like Europe's awakening. I mean, whether it is genuine shift within the European thinking, or it's a temporary panic. Because, you see, the coalition of the willing, or the defense spending, has surged in Europe. The UK, Poland, trilateral, something appears to be changing in Europe too. But you have also, I mean, I'm going back to one of your writings where you have said, and quite persistently, Russia first thinking in Berlin or Paris, that effectively gives Moscow a veto over NATO's strategic decisions, right? I mean, which Europe are we actually dealing with right now? I mean, is it the one that is finally waking up, or is it the one that is willing to compromise with Moscow, or is it the one still quietly hoping this problem resolves itself? Which one?
I would say that we have really good news about Europe. First of all, that these Russia first thinking in most of the countries already vanished. And the leaders of the countries really don't think like this. Russia made everything possible for this to happen by their behavior. We know how the different European leaders tried to speak in 2014 and 2022. And Russia each time really violated all their promises to the European leaders. And started a lot of the provocations in the Baltics, in the Nordic, in the Arctic, around the British Isles. So as for now, I don't hear this Russia first policy for sure. We finally hear the Europe first policy, and that's important. The second is about awakening. We have also several good news, and it's not just about money. Money is important, but it is secondary in our case. First is that European leaders finally acknowledged that a war can be in Europe. Because everybody thought after 1991 that war in Europe is impossible. Okay, not 1991, but after the Balkans War, yeah, but not against the NATO member state or European Union member state. So we finally have the acknowledgement of military, of security services, of intelligence, and of politicians that, yes, war can come and we should be prepared what we do for this. The second is that the finally stopped thinking that the US would come and protect them, that they need to be responsible for their own security and really to invest in this. And when we say invest, money is one. We see the change of the budget, the increase of the budgets, but it is preparation of your forces, because in many countries, forces were in the very relaxed manner. They didn't check the maintenance of their tanks, for example, or they had long old procedures about the recruitment or about manufacturing. And the last but not the least pillar that's extremely important, that Europe started to think about rearming. And they started to think about the military industry and production and the different developments, research and development, investment in this. If you look to the SAFE program, if you look to the latest European Union programs, especially for the countries to be able to acquire capabilities. And then for these, Ukraine is a very important part because they don't see it separately, Ukraine from their defense and military industry. There are a lot of the joint exercises. It is creation of the JTAC. It is a joint analysis teaching exercises center. So NATO Ukraine Center in Poland, where we have the whole circle of the lessons learned, when we have Ukrainians helping to train now or to do the joint exercises with the Europeans. So it is all these, many of the big and small puzzles that create the big picture of Europe becoming a real security actor. Despite definitely, it's still the problem of growth, and it is still the problem of some individual politicians like Mr. Orban in Hungary. But in general, you see this agreement between West and East, between North and South European countries, between left parties and the right political spectrum. So Europe is changing, that's for sure.
Now, if Europe is changing, that brings me to another question. Whenever you look into the literature about Ukraine, or perhaps the discussion about Ukraine, and you and I had discussion in Bangkok, I think, a couple of years back as well. And the question is then, we do look into the United States, we do look into the European Union, but that also gives me another eerie feeling. That is the multilateralism becoming irrelevant when it comes to Ukraine. This is a great lesson for the Global South. As you know, that this whole conversation about Global South is gaining momentum. We have seen the Security Council was paralyzed by vetoes. We have seen that the Budapest memorandum proved to be quite inadequate, and International Court of Justice is quite ignored. I mean, whether it is in the case of Ukraine or in the case of Israel or in the case of Myanmar or many other cases, I can cite hundreds of experiences. Now, that means that Ukraine has actually experienced a systematic exposure of every kind of multilateral protection mechanism the post-world order has built. I mean, literally what gives me a sense these days is that we are actually going back to pre-Westphalian system. Now, for the smaller states in Asia or Africa or perhaps the global south, this is where I bring in your expertise, that depend on that particular order. We were very comfortable with that kind of international liberal order in which the sovereignty was pretty much guaranteed. And do you think that this multilateralism, I mean, I don't get to hear UN, I don't get to hear other regional organizations coming into the Ukrainian discussion. Is that multilateralism still salvageable? Can Ukraine issue be solved through the United Nations or other mechanism? Or perhaps are we now in a world where only military capacity and great power patronage actually protects you? I mean, what do you think about it?
No, it's not that black and white, I would say. First of all, multilateral doesn't mean only the United Nations. And a lot of the efforts that you see about Ukraine, they are exactly multilateral. The European Union is multilateral. NATO is multilateral. The coalition of willing that helps Ukraine, or Ramstein format, it is multilateral. Even more, we started to use their term minilateral as well. So it is the small alliances of the 3-4 countries that are ready to help each other. But it's still multilateral. Yes, it's not just bilateral relations or bilateral guarantees that are important. And it seems to me that within this war, the multilateral, especially Ukraine-EU track, was extremely important because what Russia always wants, that's easier for them to break us country by country. That's why in 2014, 2022, they tried to break this unity within the European Union, coming to each individual country. Because for them, it's really dangerous when the whole European Union is adopting sanctions, for example, against them. Because it's easy to bypass sanctions of one country. What to do if all the biggest economies are implying sanctions against you. And then you see that to these multilateral formats, we have Australia, we have Japan, we have South Korea, New Zealand who are joining, or Chile. So it's not just European multilateralism that is helping Ukraine. When you go to those examples that you provided, first of all, about the United Nations, I think that our biggest mistake was always to concentrate only at the Security Council. Yes, Security Council is a relic of the Second World War, but Ukraine had a lot because of the UNESCO, because of the UNICEF activities in Ukraine, because of the UNDP help with the reconstruction that is happening now. But even the world then, Ukraine together with the World Food Organization really helped with the food security problems of the global south when Russia blocked Ukrainian ports and exports of the Ukrainian grains and sunflower oil. We couldn't do it a lot. We needed these multilateral organizations for being facilitators and providers and enablers of the delivery. So that's why I always call to see United Nations bigger and wider than just 15 members of the Security Council. And even more, the General Assembly since 2022, adopted an extremely important resolutions. 143 countries voted for these resolutions about Ukraine and about Russian aggression. And that helps later in the international courts when Ukrainian business would like to go, for example, or when the Ukrainian citizens who've been under the tortures and occupation apply to the human rights courts and receive their compensation. So that is, these really mix of everything that you just need to know how to use the instruments of multilateral organization. Yes, Russia undermined it with a constant veto or with manipulations of some of the mechanisms, but we don't have anything better. You cannot solve everything with the armed forces. You need this mechanism that we've been building because that's what protects the middle powers and small states within this huge international system of the big powers competition. With ICJ, Ukraine had 2 successful cases back before 2022, and we now have the third case, where at this stage, International Court of Justice already adopted their preliminary decision saying that Russia is guilty. They clearly said when the occupation started, for example, or for the first time, we are using the International Convention of the State Sponsoring of Terrorism. Nobody ever tried to apply with this convention to the ICG. Ukraine has done it. It's in the process now, and that's also the precedent that other countries will be able to use. And we created now a tribunal for the war crimes in Ukraine. That's, again, multilateral. It's not Ukrainian tribunal. It's international community who gathered together and did it. The most difficult issue is Budapest Memorandum. And here, you and I know, even from the name, memorandum is not a treaty.
Absolutely.
It doesn't have any legally binding or obligations. However, it's politically very important because Ukraine rejected the third biggest in the world nuclear arsenal. And big powers promised territorial integrity, not interference in our affairs, and everything else. Where we are, one of those who signed Budapest Memorandum, Moscow, clearly violated everything what is written there. And that has problems not only for Ukraine. Now, when you go to Iran, when you go to any other country that would like to acquire nuclear weapons and saying, please don't do it, we will give you security guarantees, what you receive back. Can we trust your security guarantees? Can you really protect us? And we see now more and more states who are saying that they would like to acquire nuclear weapons. So we have de facto the very serious crisis of the nuclear non-proliferation regime in the world. But even wider, not only nuclear, I think that now you ask in your very first question about the security commitments, I think that after Ukraine, after the last month's events in the Middle East, more and more countries are asking, what does really mean security guarantees? First of all, the US security guarantees. Can US protect us? Can US defend us? Will they be willing to do it? And also what type of the capabilities we need to have inside of our country to be ready to the very bad scenario that Americans are not coming.
Interesting, but one thing I must tell you that I'm a cynical realist, but it is intriguing for me that you still have optimism about the multilateralism in a sense of United Nations and so on, and that's really refreshing to hear from somebody who comes from a very, very deep conflict society. I mean, I won't say society, I mean the region, and that's really refreshing to hear. Now, here is the question. I mean, you talked about Ukraine's support for the Gulf and the expertise that Ukraine would bring in for the Gulf is going to be quite valuable. But the problem rise is somewhere else. This is a geopolitical puzzle that we are now seeing. Even if you look at the Iran, Russia, China axis, I mean, some would say this is a durable coalition. Some would say it's just a marriage of convenience. You know, this war in Iran has deepened what some call a revisionist axis. I mean, Iranian drones, North Korean interest, Chinese dual-use support, and a shared interest in dismantling Western-led institutions to a great extent. I mean, this is one of the criticisms I get to hear. But if you listen to Beijing, it is essentially a moral degradation of the Western power too. Now, from the Ukraine's frontline vantage point where you are, how solid is this alignment given that Ukraine is really willing to bypass some sort of understanding that we get to see when it comes to Russia and China? And how does the recent escalation against Iran's nuclear programs that you have also mentioned that many countries want nuclear now affect Russia's access to Iranian military hardware, or does it actually help or hurt Moscow or Ukrainian engagement in the Gulf theater? Will that not only make Russia more paranoid, or perhaps will that give any advantage to Kyiv?
Your question has very different layers. It's not like one question if you look from the Ukrainian perspective. And I would try to be short for each, but just to portray it how it is seen from Ukraine.
Right.
First, if you return back to the April last month's events, Russia was very bad with drones technologies originally. They didn't believe in them. Only after the Nagorno-Karabakh war of 1920s, 2020s, they started looking at them, and only with the Ukrainian war they started developing their drones. And de facto, they didn't have any big drones before Shaheds. The Iranian drone technology significantly changed for the last 3 years. Russia invested a lot with what they were good with like improving them. Now it is like small missiles, but Russia would be unable of doing it without Iran. And we know how much of the weapons Iranians been delivering to Russia, including drones within this year till the very last moment. So in this case, Ukraine consider Iran as an enemy and as the party to the war because of we started to have problems with them a little bit earlier when they shot down Ukrainian civilian airplane in the Iranian airspace. It was the Tehran Kyiv flight. It was in 2021, and all our negotiations, they've been just rejecting anything. So not even showing the guilt or excuse to the hundreds of Ukrainians and Canadians that had been killed in that flight. So we already had tense relations. Then they openly started supporting Russia with weapons. None of the other countries did it so openly. You understand, that we didn't have any sentiments and we considered them as our allies. And but still, we were very careful because for us, the main was the Russian Federation. We just demonstrated to other countries what consequences it can have because Russian technology went to Iran. So we needed to understand that Iran is becoming more problematic in terms of their military capabilities and what they can do. But how it was important for Russia? Trust me, very important, because Russia is extremely dependent on the spare parts, up to 70, and in some of the hardware, up to 90% of the spare parts in their military hardware are foreign made. Now more and more Chinese, previously from different countries, but their military industry significantly depends on others. That's why we're really looking for these partners. And then it is the question of the current events. The Gulf states were very helpful to Ukraine during this war, not with the military support, but as the mediators. Qatar became a leader of helping to return back Ukrainian kidnapped kids. You know that Russia kidnapped almost 20,000 of Ukrainian kids with the forced adoption, Russification, and everything happening now. And Qatar became one of the main countries helping to return, to trace these kids and return them back. Emirates, despite being the black hole for the Russian money and bypassing of sanctions, but they helped a lot with the negotiations and with the return of the Ukrainian prisoners of war. The same with the Saudi Arabia. It was the venue for the negotiations and helping with the return of prisoners of war. And many, many other cases where these countries were very helpful for Ukraine. And in this case, we understand that they were not aggressors. They were not trying to spoil relations with Iran. Some of these countries even been facilitating the dialogue between Iran and the US. So that's why when Iran started attacking these countries, we understood that we can help and we would like to help them as the good friends of Ukraine. Because when Iran announced that they are targeting just military objects, it was absolutely the same rhetoric as we had from the Russian Federation. So I know how the hospitals or theaters or the museums or churches are destroyed by Russian missiles and or totally residential areas. But the Ministry of Defense are coming to the morning briefing and saying that they've been only military objects. The same having friends in Qatar calling in the morning like, guys, what is happening? I saw the pictures and I know that these areas are definitely not where American military are based. So it was the same tactic with the same statements. And it was logical for Ukraine just to provide help where we can, because you saw a strong air defense against the missiles when you see statistics, what was being intercepted in all the countries. But they appeared totally unprepared to the Iranian drones. And here, what you have, You have Ukrainian technologies, Ukrainian knowledge, and Ukrainians being ready to train. So we are not party to the conflict. We are not joining the efforts of fight to something. We are just sharing something what is really important to defend the Gulf states.
That was absolutely fascinating. I mean, that brings me to my last question, Anna. And I'm not going to give you multi-layered question. I'm going to give you a very plain question over here. And I can see you're drinking a lot of water. But going back to my last question, I mean, this is much more to do with what you have mentioned. I mean, hybrid warfare. I mean, you look into drones. The nature of war has changed. There has been rapture. There has been depolarization, I mean, Moscow, Beijing, Washington, and of course, Brussels very much there when it comes to Kyiv. Now, my last question would be, I mean, given your optimism, given your pessimism, given your cynical realism, or perhaps my one, and altogether, what would the world look like after the war, if there is an end to this war? What does the world actually need to get right? I mean, my question would be, then this is much more I'm asking on behalf of my audiences well beyond Europe. I mean, whatever settlement eventually emerges, what does Ukraine actually need from the international community to ensure its sovereignty, or perhaps that model should be replicated by the other countries, particularly those are in the Pacific or South Asia or elsewhere. Because I get to see quite often that the logic of arms and defense, as you have rightly mentioned, that disarmament and everything, nuclear proliferation is largely becoming eroded. What we get to see that logic of might override is watching and learning. So the last question, and very plain one, once the settlement is there, what international community should do or put in place so that others can also be comfortable?
You're absolutely right that probably we will not see the world as we used to. So it would be not the post-Second World War. It would be something absolutely new, or not absolutely new, because the history repeats. It just repeats in the different manifestations. And here, I think that if we speak philosophically, we would need to return back to the values. Because we became too much cynical, and we forgot for what all of these, and all of these are for equality of small and big nations. It is for your dignity. It is for the human rights in the best meaning of this word, the right for living, the right for life, for just normal well-being. I would prefer to spend my summers not giving interviews to the media, but with my family, flowers at the summer house somewhere. So that's normal things that we cannot have because of the Russian activities as for now. And what all of us would like to have, just a normal life. And that's absolutely the same in Ukraine or in Bangladesh or somewhere in Samoa. And here, these basic values, it's like return to ourselves. What we would like to be. We would like to be people that are building something, that are constructing the future, not who are destroying everything and the lives of other people. But if to go from the philosophical to the more political and cynical things, I think that first of all, we need the world to understand that you cannot be neutral or fake neutral, I would say, because you cannot balance between aggressor and victim. You need to understand what it means for you. Be pro you, first of all. Look to what's happened with the maritime security and how Russia acted. Sorry, but I see absolutely the same scenarios now happening in the Indo-Pacific. China learned from Russian actions in 2018, 2021. I recently been in the Philippines. We discussed a lot what's been happening there, and or in Taiwan, in Japan. That's just my last year. In Chile, where is Japan? Where is Chile? But we look to the map. We look to the numbers, how much they are exports and the life being depends on the ports, how protected are their ports, how easy is to block the navigation in the straits, like Malacca Straits or any others. And what will it mean for the lives of the people? Are they prepared? And we know that China very carefully learning from Russian actions by passing of sanctions, sanctions against us or sanctions against other aggressor or other country. They are the same mechanisms. If you allow now to bypass the sanctions, if you allow now for Russia to be not punished for their aggression, you cannot be sure that tomorrow another country would not repeat the same, because they're learning now how weak can be international community reaction to these actions. That's why it is in the interest of other countries, especially small and middle powers, to ensure that international norms are working, that our mechanisms for deterrence are working, that we know who are our friends, that we are learning, that we are building the new alliances. So in this case, it's much wider than just Ukraine, because you see North Korea learning from Russia, China learning from Russia, Iran learning from Russia, Russia learning from these countries in particularly. Who are the next one? Can you be sure that you would not have around you? We also in 2014 been absolutely sure that the war will never come to the Ukrainian territory and that we don't have any border disputes with our neighbors. So how this war would finish, I don't know. There are so many scenarios, unfortunately, good and bad scenarios, unpredictable scenarios. But what I definitely know that we cannot wait till the end of this war to learn lessons, both from the start, from the process, and thinking about the future arrangements. The United Nations or any type of the multilateral mechanism is as strong as the member states would allow it to be. So it is in our hands, in the hands of Bangladesh, in the hands of Kyiv, in the hands of the Philippines, in the hands of Chile, in the hands of Canada, to make it working. And here, let's see how it would go. I think that the main principles, the main values, they're universal. They're not European or Ukrainian. They're universal. And we just need to look for the better version of ourselves.
Thank you, Anna. I think what strikes me the most during your answer to my last question is when you said, who will be the next one? And I think that is where the paranoia keeps coming in. And you are absolutely right. When we look into the international norm is falling apart. And this is where the countries must come together. And the alliance must be based on respecting international norms, international law, and most importantly, the universality of values and the norms that we got to see we depended on over the past 7 decades since the United Nations came into force and the Universal Human Rights Declaration came in. And obviously, who are our friends? I mean, the friends are changing too. I mean, I work on a theory called multilateral transactionality, and this is where I often become quite sad that everything is eventually becoming transactional, whether we see it in the changes in Beijing or Washington or London or Moscow or even in Dhaka or Delhi or Islamabad, wherever we go. With that note, Anna, thank you very much for your time. And I think my audience will appreciate the very alternative thoughts that you have really discussed with us. I mean, even if you look at how Ukrainians are looking into the Iranian crisis, is something very new for us. And with that note, thank you, Anna, for your time. And let me say half a minute conclusion to my audience. Dear audience, as you have listened to Dr. Shelest, and I think she has really spelled out not only optimism, but also really spelled out lessons for the international community. As I was speaking, or as I was mentioning, that who will be the next one is still a question that every defense policy maker, foreign policy makers, and perhaps those who are in the government, whether the populist, the authoritarian, the democratic ones, or perhaps the socialist or communist one, everybody is really worried about. And Hanna has really talked about how countries learn from each other. And we are now seeing that nuclear proliferation is becoming the new norm, and many countries want to acquire, because what we are now seeing is that the trust over the conventional international order is dwindling. That's why we also talked about this squeezed space for international order to function in international relations, international politics, or perhaps security and stability. With that note, thank you very much for your patient hearing, and please do appreciate our guest. She woke up very early to join us for this particular conversation. Thank you very much for your time.